Getting in the Wood by Gary Snyder. The sour smell, blue stain, water squirts out round the wedge, lifting quarters of rounds covered with ants, a living glove of ants upon my hand. The pole of the sledge a bit peened over, so the wedge springs off and tumbles, ringing like high-pitched bells, into the complex duff of twigs, poison oak bark, sawdust, shards of logs, and the sweat drips down. Smell of crushed ants. The lean and heave on the peavey that breaks free the last of a bucked 3-foot round. It lies flat on smashed oaklings. Wedge and sledge, peavey and maul, little axe, canteen, piggyback can of saw-mix gas and oil for the chain, knapsack of files and goggles and rags, all to gather the dead and the down. The young men throw splits on the piles, bodies hardening, learning the pace, and the smell of tools from this delve in the winter death topple of elderly oak. 4 chords.
Hello and welcome back to Bookish. Today I want to do the next video in Kelly from Books I'm Not Reading an Eye series called Poetry for Beginners. This month's poet was Gary Snyder, who is the author of the poem that I just read called Getting in the Wood. Gary Snyder is an American poet who first probably gained attention and some level of notoriety as a member of the beatnik literary arts movement in the 1950s. Snyder was a good friend with Jack Kerouac. Snyder is, in fact, one of the main characters in Kerouac's book, The Dharma Bums. His character name in the book is Jaffe Ryder. And just as was true in the book, is true in real life, it is Snyder who introduced Jack Kerouac to Buddhism and meditation. He got an opportunity to travel and study in Japan, and he spent most of the rest of the 1950s and the early part of the 1960s in Japan and China, and he traveled to India, and all the things he studied, the poetry he studied, the culture he studied, the religion he studied, definitely had a big impact and a big influence on his life and on his work. In 1974, Snyder published a book of poetry called Turtle Island, which won the Pulitzer Prize, and so I guess that's probably his most famous book of poetry. You know, Gary Snyder led a fairly interesting life, I think. He worked in the forests of the Pacific Northwest as a lumberjack. He worked as a fire spotter, you know, those guys who stays up on those really high stations just looking out for forest fires. He was a trail marker. For a while, he taught himself to be an expert mountain climber. When he returned home from Asia, he built his own house by hand. I think his home is somewhere in the Sierra Nevada mountains near the Yuba River, and I think he's still living there today. So almost everything that Snyder experiences, from what I can tell, shows up somewhere in his work, including in the poem I read, Getting the Wood In. So his work is kind of a combination of all kinds of things, just kind of, you know, mysticism and metaphysics and nature writing and environmentalism. At the same time, he frequently celebrates work and the details of work, again, as he does in this poem. I had a hard time finding a poem of Snyder's that really spoke to me, but this poem spoke to me. This poem, Getting in the Wood, spoke to me because it reminded me of growing up in East Texas. And every Thanksgiving break, my family and I went into the woods on land that belonged or was owned by members of my family, and we cut firewood. You know, my dad, my grandfather with chainsaws cut down trees. They delimbed them, they cut them into pieces, and then me and whoever else was there working with us, we would split the wood using sledgehammers, mauls, and wedges, and then we would load it into trucks and we would deliver the wood to family members. And so a lot of the images in Getting in the Wood really reminded me of that experience growing up. So I thought I'd just go through the poem and talk about some of the things in the poem that seemed particularly important to me or that reminded me of those experiences that I had growing up. The very first line, the very first section of the poem says, "The sour smell, blue stain, water squirts out round the wedge, lifting quarters of rounds covered with ants, a living glove of ants upon my hand." That section is just essentially an experience that I've had. Fresh cut wood smells sour. Oak and hickory, there is a sour smell, there's a tangy scent that comes from a fresh cut living tree. The blue stain is, I believe, the stain of the chain and the chainsaw passing through the wood. The chain has to be oiled, I'll talk about that later, but also just generally speaking makes kind of almost like a burned or a smear on part of the cut end of the wood. Water squirts out round the wedge. The center of a fresh cut tree is pulpy, it's spongy, it's a little bit mushy, and when you drive the wedge in for the purpose of splitting it, there is water that is forced out around the wedge. And then lifting quarters of rounds, they cut the log that the tree has become into pieces, and usually you cut it into pieces related to the width of the fireplaces you're going to be supplying, and so those then become rounds. Those rounds are then first split in half, and the way that you do this is by taking metal wedges that are about this big and they're heavy, and as a wedge they are wedge shaped, and driving the wedges into the cut end of the round until it splits in half. Sometimes this can be done with one wedge, sometimes this has to be done with two, but then the round is split in half, and then you split each half so that you end up with quarters. Quarters that are more or less shaped like a piece of pie, only 2 feet long, however long the round was cut. The ants, by the way, are something I don't remember fondly about splitting wood. In East Texas, when I was growing up, we had fire ants, and I don't know if where you live fire ants exist yet, but fire ants are a kind of invasive species of ants that will kill off and drive out most other ants, and the bite of a fire ant stings really badly, and usually it creates a sore. So every fire ant that bites you creates a sore and a stinging, burning sensation, and if you are allergic to those kind of things, they can actually create a severe allergic reaction. So I wouldn't have been as casual about having a living glove of ants upon my hand, because fire ants are aggressive and they bite, sting almost as soon as they come into contact with skin of any kind. So the next section then is the pole of the sledge a bit peened over, so the wedge springs off and tumbles, ringing like high-pitched bells into the complex duff of twigs, poison oak, bark, sawdust, shards of logs. And the sweat drips down. Sorry, I left that line out. So oftentimes when you're driving the wedge into the cut end, into the round, if you don't hit it squarely with the 10 or 12 pound sledgehammer, if you hit it on an angle, or if in this case the head of the sledgehammer is peened over, rounded over a little bit, you don't make good square contact, and the wedge can come flying out, which is what here happens, and it does ring like a relatively high-pitched bell. And then in this case in the poem, the wedge falls into what he refers to as the complex duff of twigs, poison oak, bark, sawdust, shards of logs. This is all the detritus of cutting down trees, all the things that break off, all the things that are cut off become just this kind of bed of discarded material all around the log itself that's being cut up into pieces. And then where it says the sweat drips down, this is one of the most things I found. This is one of the things I found the most unpleasant about splitting wood in November, is that despite how cold it was, it is very hard work. Lifting the sledgehammer and bringing it down and driving the wedges and picking up the pieces of wood and loading them in a truck and moving them from one place to another is physical work, and you do sweat. And there's something about sweating and getting really hot and sweaty in the wintertime that I found to be incredibly unpleasant. So the next section says, smell of crushed ants. The lean and heave on the peavy that breaks free, the last of a bucked 3-foot round, it lies flat on smashed oaklings. So, the smell of crushed ants. There have to be a lot of ants for you to smell crushed ants. But there is kind of a metallic smell, if my memory is correct, about a lot of smashed ants. And I think there's something important about this line, smell of crushed ants, because for the first time I think Snyder is making it clear that what's happening is that people are killing things. They're killing ants, they're killing trees, there is destruction taking place here. So then, the lean and heave on the peavy that breaks free, the last of a bucked 3-foot round, it lies flat on smashed oaklings. So notice the language of destruction here, breaks free, smashed oaklings. The language of destruction here begins to pick up. You know, we're still talking primarily about nature being destroyed by human activity here. But a couple of terms in that also I thought were worth talking about. A peavy is a tool with a handle, about a shovel-length handle, and it's got a spike and kind of a curved tooth on it. And what you do is you use that to break apart, to wedge in between, cut pieces of the log to break them apart. Sometimes when the person with the chainsaw cuts through, they don't cut all the way through, and you can use the peavy to, you know, lean on it, and you can split apart or break apart the last little attached bits of one round from another. And then a bucked 3-foot round. Bucking a tree is cutting into pieces and delimbing it, and in this case apparently they're doing that in 3-foot sections. Okay, so this next section of the poem is actually my favorite. Wedge and sledge, peavy and maul, little axe, canteen, piggyback can of salt mix, gas, and oil for the chain, knapsack of files and goggles and rags, all together the dead and the down. So I just like I like the music he gets out of using all those names for the tools that you use when cutting and splitting wood. I just like the way he puts them together in those pairs. Wedge and sledge, obviously, peavy and maul. Little axe, canteen, piggyback can of saw mixed gas and oil for the chain, knapsack of files and goggles and rags. That's just a really, to me, kind of a musical section, and that's my favorite section of the poem. A couple of things there. A maul is kind of an axe-shaped tool, which is, it's a little bit of an axe, it's a little bit of a wedge. Sometimes people who are talented and with the right kind of wood can use a maul to split the wood itself and kind of save the whole, you know, driving the wedges in with a sledgehammer. The saw mix gas. A lot of chainsaws, at least in the past, I'm not sure if that's true today, require you to mix the gasoline and the oil together in a certain ratio, and that's actually the fuel that it runs on, so that the two things are mixed together at once. Oil for the chain. The chain on a chainsaw has to stay oiled. The files are for sharpening the teeth on the chainsaw. Goggles to protect your eyes, and rags because there's a lot of oily crap going on when you're cutting down trees. And then, you know, the poem, as I think is true with lots of poems, kind of comes together here in the end and reminds a reminder. The last line of the section I read before was all together the dead and the down. So the last section says, the young men throw splits on the piles, bodies hardening, learning the pace and the smell of tools from this delve in the winter death topple of elderly oak. 4 chords. So these are young men throwing the split pieces of wood into piles. But notice when it says young men throw splits on the piles' bodies, it's directly making this connection between the split wood and the bodies of the dead, because the trees in this case are the deads. Bodies hardening, learning the pace, so he kind of blends the two things together here with young men on the job, learning how to do that work and the pace at which the work has to be done, learning everything about the job, including the smell of the tools, and then from this delve in the winter death topple of elderly oak, youth destroying age, perhaps. Perhaps that's the image, the symbolism that he's going for, or man destroying nature one way or the other. And then the last line is 4 chords. A cord of wood is, I think I wrote it down, it's 4 feet wide, 4 feet high, and 8 feet long, and I think that comes out to 128 cubic feet of wood. Firewood is usually sold by the cord or the half cord. Anyway, that's my take on Gary Snyder's Getting in the Wood, a poem which spoke to me because of my own experiences growing up. I hope you'll take a look at Kelly's video about Gary Snyder, and I'll leave a link to it down below when it's published, or if she's out first, I'll put it down there now. And thanks for watching. I look forward to seeing your comments in the comment section.